Yeah, thank you, Pierre, and I hope you hear me all right. Um, yeah, it's a pleasure to join your course. I don't know how many of you there are out there, but hopefully I see your faces at some point. And yeah, it's nice to when I was first contacted about the course by Pierre, I was yeah, maybe let's say a little bit sad that it didn't exist when I was at ETH Zurich. So that's I'm happy that you now have such a course. Um, and I want to speak to you today a bit about our work. Pierre said pragmatic. We'll see how pragmatic it is. I think everything here is quite also conceptual. But just a little bit about myself. My name is Daniel Hall. I'm an assistant professor at TU Delft, and I've been working with thinking around blockchain for I'd say the last 6 years or so. And a large part of that is also in collaboration with Dr. Jens Hunhevicz, who I see now on the in the back of the room. Jens, maybe you also want to just quickly give a short introduction before we get started, and then I'll share my screen.
Professor at ETH, and I work now still at ETH in the circle and also at EMPA in the energy systems lab. And I do blockchain related research in energy. Not so much about DAOs anymore. One or two work packages during my PhD work about DAOs, and it's among the one things that we present. So, yeah, maybe.
Nice. Thanks, Jens. All right, so I have my slides queued up, and I assume you see them fine in full screen. And the title of our presentation is actually mirrors the title of the paper that we just published, which Jens was the first author, which is called Decentralized Project Delivery on the Crypto Commons, Conceptualization, Governance Mechanisms, and Future Research Directions. And the talk is actually structured exactly under those three subheadings. So first, I'm going to begin by giving you a little bit of the background of how we started, why we started working on this, and how we started conceptualizing decentralized project delivery. At a certain point, Jens will take over there, and he will also then go into the governance mechanisms. And then finally, it'll come back to me at the end to talk about the future research directions. I understand from Pierre that you previously already had a talk from ArchiDAO, so I don't need to say very much about them. But I want to start with this because for me, this was a very much a helpful entry point. It's actually not the way that I entered into it, but I think it's a helpful way to understand what the challenge here is, right? So ArchiDAO promotes itself as the first DAO by architects for architects, and I'm a big supporter of their great experiment. But I also think there's a lot of practical challenges that come when you move design into the DAO space. And I really like the approaches that they take, and I put this in the black box, what they value a project first approach. They're looking at member rewards, better experiences, new mechanisms. Um, and I found that all to be very, very interesting. But as a researcher in me, I had so many research questions when I see something like this. And I guess you can call these also practical questions. So what is ArchiDAO? It's not an architecture firm. What is its organizational form, and how do we understand that? What are the governance structures of ArchiDAO? Now, governance is kind of this idea of how do we, guide the decision making? What are the rules of management for ArchiDAO? And when you have a very, kind of new idea, how does that governance structure emerge? How does ArchiDAO ensure that its participants are engaged? If you're going to have a design project, how do you make sure that you have this kind of amalgamous form of a DAO, which you hear about, where you have people entering and exiting? How do you make sure these people are engaged? And if I would summarize all of these questions, and since I did a lot of research on project management and construction management, what does it look like for project management when you have a DAO that's designing architecture projects in the built environment? So I think that's a helpful entry point when you think about what are we trying to accomplish. This is really, I would say, a starting point. So let me start first with the conceptualization. And now you have to, you're going to have a bit of theory here. It might be a bit dense, but we try to keep it not too detailed. I'm originally from the US. I'm from California. And in the US, we have a famous general. His name is General Patton, but he was most famous because he was in a movie. And this was the opening scene of the movie. And he's very much this example of this idea of command and control. And this is the old idea of what a manager should be. So command and control means that you really have the lead, the hierarchy is around the lead person, and their job is to command and control. And this translates to project delivery. So when you're designing a project or when you're a general contractor working on a project, you really want to command and control. So you tell everyone below you exactly what they should be doing. And this is how project management literature that emerged in the 1950s, and a lot of the concepts of managing projects came from this kind of mentality. Around 20 years ago, we started to see a shift. And the shift can be captured in the figure on the left, where this was just something I found online one day that said, this is an agile leadership team, and they're going to go from managing performance to enabling performance, right? So the idea is that no longer the manager is telling the people what to do, but they are enabling them, supporting them. And here, I think it's very telling. In the middle, the woman with the gray hair says, "I'm the CEO," but they title it the Chief Enabling Officer, not the Chief Executive Officer, right? So here, the idea is that we see a change and a shift from project management or from management being top down. I know everything and I tell you what to do, to this kind of, sometimes it's also called servant leadership. So I'm supporting you and enabling you to do really good things. And there's a lot of examples, and it's captured in this paper written about 15 years ago called Project Management 2.0, or Towards Project Management 2.0, using examples from software development, agile development of software practices, also some decentralized military operations, to show how when you have very fast data that can be created in synchronous time, that you kind of push the decision making to the edges, and this creates a much more effective project management style. Well, I found that to be really interesting, and many of you, some of you maybe know this famous tweet as well, which talks about the context of Web3. And I think it's a really helpful thing. So if you talk about Web 1, it was just about the information economy, about reading information. Then you get to the point where you go to Web 2, and now they have the platform economy. So now you have synchronous information where you can read and write information. Everyone has that ability to do that, and you have a lot of information generation. To the idea of Web3 being the ownership economy. So you can read, write, but you also have the ability now to own assets. And the Web 1 and Web 2 were also kind of theorized to correspond with these shifts in project management. So in the Web 1 world, it was really about the information economy. You control the information, you have traditional publishers. Web 2, you have the platform economy, and now you have this kind of edge creators who are doing things. But the question is, what is the kind of project management shift that will happen in a Web3 world? So what will happen when we start experiencing this ownership economy? And DAOs, I think, are very much a point of that, where you have people participating in this kind of world. So this was the kind of theoretical challenge that we set forward with. The question was, on what basis do we conceptualize this shift? Okay, yeah, it's one thing to say we need a new management style in an era of Web3. And we need to think about how architects will design in a DAO, but how do we even start thinking about or basing a conceptualization or a theory for this? And from there, I really drew inspiration from some of my previous work, even before I started working on blockchain, from the commons. So this is one of my favorite pictures I took when I was hiking in Switzerland, just one of those amazing clear days in the Berner Oberland. And if you know the concept of the commons, it's the idea that you have these kind of shared resource pools, or common pool resources. An example would be herding. So if the pasture is available for everyone to take a little piece from, that's really good, but it can also lead to something called the tragedy of the commons. So in that situation, every rationally acting herder or farmer will then to send his cows to go eat as much grass as they can, because they get the direct benefit there. But the deterioration of the commons, so if they eat too much grass, there's a delayed cost there. So that actually starts hurting you in the long term. But in the short term, you don't feel that. So you just say, well, I'm just going to eat as much grass as I can. I get the best cows, and et cetera, et cetera. And the idea was that as these rationally acting herders incentivized to add more and more and more animals, then the overall resource availability kind of is like a downward spiral. You hear it also with fishing as well, but it also occurs in man-made situations. It can also happen, for example, with parking lots or other types of things. So this is the tragedy of the commons. And for a while, scholars thought that the tragedy of the commons was inevitable and that we needed a centralized government and a project management 1.0 type of approach to deal with situations where there was a common pool resource scenario. But then along came Elinor Ostrom, and she won the Nobel Prize in 2009 because she basically said, no, actually, you're wrong. There are principles to govern the commons. When you have a kind of pluralistic and a shared resource and environment, we actually find that there are 8 specific design principles which are effective to design and to control these, to best manage these common pool resources. And I would just give you could read them here, and they're going to come back up again. But the idea is that you create nice boundaries for the resource and nice boundaries for the users. So you're very clear about who's participating in the commons. You make sure that they're aligned with the local conditions. You also make sure you have collective choice arrangements, which means that, everyone together is making decisions. Something you might also, think about, you see in DAOs as well. You monitor the resources and the users, so you don't just let anybody do whatever they want, but you have kind of monitoring approaches to check and see how much people are using. You create a system of graduated sanctions against violations. This means that the first instance, you kind of might socially say, hey, don't do that, and let people know someone's not acting well. But the sanctions keep increasing until eventually you might kick somebody out of your commons. There's very low-cost conflict resolution mechanisms. There's a recognition of the rights to organize, saying that everyone that participates has a right to participate in the system. And if the system is very complex, you also might want to look at nested enterprise structures. So you have a kind of system, it still has a bit of a hierarchy, but it might be kind of different levels. So that's the idea of that common pool resources, can be an interesting kind of governance scenario that we could think about. But as we shift to Web3, we started to question, could these also be an appropriate way to think about the governance of DAOs? We're not the only ones that think this way. I saw this post a few weeks ago, from a think tank group called Dark Matter Labs, and I particularly liked it. The first two I like, but the third one is the main point here. So they're talking about shifts in our worldview from the world that we exist today to where we're going. So the first one is going from objects to agents. And if you've then looked at anything around AI, you kind of see this one as definitely the situation. The second is to go from externalities to entanglement. So there's the idea that, traditionally the job of architects or engineers was to kind of position things as externalities and say they're beyond my scope, so I don't deal with these things. But then we could start to think about now, how do we become more entangled with complex systems and embrace the complexity? And the third one, which I think is, really the heart of what I'm talking about today, is the idea that we're moving from this private and public dichotomy, where some things are private and some things are public, to the idea of commoning, which is a bit more of an integrated and collective approach to lots of different things. So this is a kind of shift in a worldview that also aligns with this idea of common pool resources. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Jens to talk about how, from that starting point, we then specifically began to investigate and understand how blockchain enabled the kind of governance of this decentralized project delivery system as we move forward. So Jens, if that's a good place to hand it over to you, I will do that.
So I think it's first a bit more theory. I think it's quite important to understand the connection now between what Daniel presented, the common pool resource, and the Ostrom principles, then why this relates to project delivery and construction, and also how it connects to blockchain. I mean, you maybe can think about it yourself, but we try to think about this very structured in our paper. And the shared the shared denominator is the Ostrom principles. So these principles that Elinor Ostrom introduced that you should follow in case you want to avoid the tragedy of the commons in a common pool resource scenario without central government. So why this is interesting for construction is that project delivery sometimes shares mechanisms that resemble or are guided by the Ostrom principles. And it's not every project delivery that does that. It's a certain type of project delivery. And we call this collaborative project delivery. One example is integrated project delivery. It's one form that is often used in the US. We have some things, sometimes we have pilots also in Switzerland for integrierte Projektabwicklung, or sometimes alliance contracting, Allianzverträge is something similar. So this is a new form of project delivery that has certain new features, more bottom-up, more shared collaborative governance in place. So the high-level idea is that instead of having individual project firms that compete for the resource budget, you bundle the resources and you have a shared risk-reward contract. So only if the overall project is successful, the individual companies will have profit. So they also share at the same time the risk, of course. So if the overall project is unsuccessful, everyone loses. And this should hinder that like individual firms working on the same project shift risks to the other companies, right? So that you gain, but the other lose and the overall project suffers. So this is kind of the incentive structure they use to avoid that. And inside, because this needs a lot more collaboration, they have specific rules how to manage and handle these sort of projects. And they are very much aligned with the Ostrom principles. This is also previous work of Daniel, and we will come back to some of these mechanisms in a minute. And then why is it interesting to have blockchain in this whole game? Because on a high level, a blockchain is also a common pool resource. It's very similar to free and open source software. So there is like research that says Wikipedia is a common pool resource problem because everyone wants to read the articles, but no one wants to really write them, right? So you have kind of a free rider problem there too. And blockchains are very expensive systems to operate.
Hey, what's up?
I don't want to go into the technical details how a
You
blockchain
hear me?
works, but you have a lot of computers that need to be
Hello.
powered. They have to have a lot of calculation tasks that
What?
also need energy. And then you need to participate in some mining activities to add new transactions. So this is a lot of effort. And without having a proper incentive structure in place that like incentivize people to contribute there, you would have a similar problem. So the very interesting thing is how did blockchain solve this free rider problem? And it was a very, very unique new approach, and we will come back to this. And with that, we go to governance and go maybe a step back to say, why is it interesting to look at more bottom-up coordination or more decentralized coordination in construction? So I mean, you're all from architecture, you know a bit construction. So it was repeatedly theorized as complex system. And I think it's also quite easy to see that you have a lot of interactions between a lot of stakeholders that need to coordinate different tasks. They are outdoors, they're interdependent, dependent on weather, they're dependent on traffic, on other supply chains that need to be in line with the overall construction project, which creates a lot of like nonlinear feedback loops that are very hard to control. And in this kind of settings, we talk about complexity. That is kind of the emergence and nonlinear feedback loop is the definition of what a complex system is. And there is also a lot of management or governance theory that kind of says, how do you best manage a complex system? And this decentralized bottom-up coordination is often the most the most suggested approach to manage such a system. So the idea is then like this is inspired by nature. If you think about bees or ants, how they coordinate, they have very simple rules at the individual level that together create together optimize a shared goal, right? But also in man-made systems, for example, traffic control, they use more and more of these decentralized organization, or wind turbine optimization. They have also more decentralized core control approaches. So collaborative project delivery, or IPD, goes along those lines. It starts to create more bottom-up coordination, more decentralized coordination, and it's in the cases it's applied often very successful. And the idea there is that it's overall decentralized collaborative project delivery is in general the better suited approach to manage a complex construction industry. But now with technology, we have the means to create maybe even more decentralized or even more agile management systems that can better handle construction. So this is kind of the motivation. And the blockchains have a very new and unique mechanism designed to kind of create new coordination mechanisms. And they use like code, so simple rules. Sometimes you use smart contracts like in DAOs to define those rules, and they have tokens like value containers. Maybe money can be money, something else, something that people value. And Bitcoin did the first time apply such a crypto economic mechanism approach. So for the miners that do the efforts and contribute to the common pool resource of blockchain, they earn Bitcoin. And with that, they kind of recreated the incentive problem of digital commons. And a lot of the blockchains nowadays, they actually work like that. They have these tokens to kind of incentivize contributions to the blockchain or keep users in the system, for example. So it's blockchain's approach to common pool resource theory. And there is a lot of theory that also, like not just us, it's other researchers that start to see these connections, and they try to, they identify which mechanisms, crypto economic mechanisms in blockchain align with which Ostrom principles and how this all comes together. And in our research, we kind of clustered this. I mean, you don't need to read all of this, but basically there is a lot of mechanisms in blockchain that can be aligned with different Ostrom principles. And what we did as a next step is after we clustered and analyzed this, we thought, okay, what are the proposed blockchain applications for construction? There is a lot of literature and papers on that. And we started to see whether they align with these other mechanisms that we identified. And with the end, we created kind of a map how blockchain could be used in line with common pool resource theory as a new way to manage construction projects. So this is the overall high-level idea, and I give you some examples now. So I think on a high level, it's very important that you have, I think the most important feature of blockchain is the addresses. It sounds simple, but it's really how you identify users or resources in the system through addresses, right? So you can identify users through addresses, then you can represent resources through tokens. Could be time, could be money. In a lot of DAOs nowadays, it's money, but it doesn't have to be money, right? It really depends what's the common resource of a DAO, right? And in construction, it's usually time, money, maybe physical resources, right? Some materials. So you need to tokenize them. And then you have a lot of monitoring and reaction technology through blockchain. The blockchain is a very transparent system. I'm sure you've heard about this. So by the design of blockchain, you have very effective monitoring like tools to kind of see what's going on in a project. And then the coordination mechanism. So basically here is where you start to use smart contracts to design the incentive mechanisms in line with the scope or goals of the project. So yeah, I mean, I tried to make this a bit to give you some examples how this actually works. So we went through all the Ostrom principles. We went through all the suggested crypto economic mechanisms for crypto commons. And we went through a lot of paper and literature on blockchain applications in construction, and we tried to map them. So for example, I thought maybe it's easier to kind of take one Ostrom principle as an example so you can understand how it is working. So Ostrom principle 1 would be in a common pool resource project, you need clearly defined boundaries for users and resources. And then there is some more description how this should work. And in construction projects in IPD, you would have firms jointly decide who is part of the multi-party contracts. So you have these multi-party contracts and you jointly decide who will be part of it and who has access to which resources. So basically the equivalent crypto commons mechanisms would be you use the addresses to identify users and who can access which resources, and you tokenize the resources. And there is not an overarching construction project using blockchain yet to govern their resources, but there is individual projects that try to that work on these mechanisms. For example, you have a company or a startup called Blockimo in Switzerland that does fractionalization of real estate, right? So you can invest in like housing through blockchain tokens. So this is the idea of using a token for a physical product, right? So you could do that also with other resources or with other money, right? And in terms of like access, I mean, it doesn't have to be voting only. And like we did some research on how we can use blockchain access mechanisms for data. So instead of using like third-party providers like Google that gives authentication to your data, you can use like decentralized protocols like blockchain, which don't rely on any third party to give you access to some project data, for example. So whoever has like the token can access the data, for example, or whoever address is whitelisted can access the data. Things like that. And I mean, another example is the contracts, where I often joke a bit where DAOs can learn from construction. I think in contracting, the construction industry or the built environment is very, very far because we have so many adverse situations where you need a lot of legal contracts to kind of keep the project on track. We are very experienced in contracting. And in DAOs, I very rarely see contracts. It's like often some free-floating agreement, not really only relying on some incentive mechanisms, not so much contracting. So there is like this, for example, these common pool resource contracts. They're pretty nice incentive mechanisms, proven to work. So why not use them, for example, for DAOs? Another area where DAOs are way better than construction projects is, for example, voting, right? So you should have like collective choice arrangements where people can vote on what to do next in the project or which design to choose. I don't know. So do you see all these very nice voting platforms emerging? Like there is like the common frameworks like Aragon, or you have like Meta Colony is another framework, or you even have like on-chain voting to kind of layer one blockchains. So these are kind of mechanisms that you could also use for construction. So basically, our idea is that all these individual mechanisms, they can in the end connect to like a system of blockchain applications to manage some sort of construction project. So, and I think this goes now into the future direction. So what does this mean? So we also had like a book chapter on like philosophizing a bit about current approaches to construction project problems. And if you look at this graph, it's like what we come up with to simplify, like, or kind of tell the story why it's worth doing what we do. So we have on the one hand industry structure, and we have the governance of the industry structure. And currently, often it's misaligned. So we often have top-down structures that for a decentralized industry. So this is what happens often in a construction use in case. And what a lot of initiatives at the moment try to do, they try to shift the industry structure to match the top-down approaches. So these are initiatives like vertical supply chain integration, where they try to simplify the supply chain, building as a product, like industrialized construction, like, well, industrialized construction can also be decentralized maybe, but it's mostly the integration. So you have less players, less connections, less collaboration needs to kind of make it simpler to coordinate the construction industry. But in essence, you just try to align it with the system we have nowadays. And the other idea would be to shift the bottom up, the governance approaches to the industry structure we see nowadays. And it's basically what IPD tries to do, or at least also using technology like blockchain, it can go more towards this direction. So we acknowledge that we have a decentralized, complex industry structure, and it's worth trying to find new approaches to coordinate in this industry that is better aligned. So this is basically the thinking that we've done.
I just want to end by giving a quick kind of example of why we think this is relevant, because it's one thing to say, well, let's just make everything a DAO. DAOs are great and they're the future, so let's go for it. But we went through this kind of theoretical exercise of kind of trying to think about a governance system for DAOs, because there is a big problem with a plurality or a pluralism situation where you have a lot of people with shared voice in a situation. You get this paralysis by indecision where nobody really takes the lead, and maybe you've experienced this on a group study project or something like that. Nobody quite has a formal role above somebody else, so it's very difficult to kind of create and chart a course forward. And I want to just end by sharing an example of a case study that we did with ArchiDAO. And I know Theo already talked about them. It was very fun because we did a master thesis here at TU Delft where we embedded ourselves with one of their project teams. And we learned a lot from observing them. And I will say this was one sub-team of about 7 people within the whole larger ecosystem of ArchiDAO. So it's not really speaking for the overall ArchiDAO as an organization. But I think it is an interesting insight into some of the challenges of doing design in a DAO team. So I don't know if Theo talked about this project, but this was the one that we studied, which was the skyscraper competition for the Evolo in 2024. It's a global contest encouraging innovative skyscraper design with a focus on novel technologies and sustainable urban solutions. And ArchiDAO entered into the design competition. So they had a multidisciplinary team from Iran and India. This was just based on volunteers. So it was, my headphones are dying, so I have to switch here. It was just based off of volunteers. So it was just happened to be that these people wanted to do this. They set up Zoom meetings, they used Discord and Telegram to communicate. But there were a lot of challenges, of course, with time constraints, coordination problems. And this is what we were observing as a kind of case study. What their process looked like was something like this. It was about a 1-year process where ArchiDAO really engaged in kind of setting up the idea. They formed the team in September of 23 and began kind of the conceptual design phase in November, December of 2023. There were also some conflicts along the way. I don't have time to get into the details there. But at a certain point, they even abandoned the Discord and started moving towards Telegram as the main form of communication. They had some people come in and out of the design team, and finally submitted in March of 2024. I don't want to give all the details here. We have a very nice master thesis if you want to read the whole thing. I just want to point out 2 main points that came out. Where in the process of an architecture DAO. These were some great quotes because we interviewed all the participants, we tried to understand exactly what their challenges and struggles were of designing in a DAO. I just pulled these out because I think they're very telling. This is about conflict. When working with strangers, because these people don't know each other, the honesty about time and skills is the most important thing. If you're not honest about these 2 facts, you'll ruin the whole process. And then this is where this member was removed because, end quotes, he became inactive suddenly. So this is one of the problems where blockchain could play a more effective role. In the context of that project, they didn't have a kind of sanctioning process or a monitoring process. So when someone just disappears, how do you incentivize them to continue to participate? Or how do you have a kind of mechanism to say that this person is no longer participating in the DAO, it becomes very difficult without these governance structures to make such a decision. In a traditional firm, your boss will tell you to do something, and if you don't do it, you probably get reassigned, or maybe you eventually get fired or let go from the job. But in this situation, when everyone's kind of participating on a kind of even platform, how do you manage these kinds of things if you're the manager or if you're a participant? The other thing was about hierarchy and decision making. I like that they point out this quote: "There will always be hierarchy. The question is how. How do you decide on this hierarchy, and what nature does it have afterwards? So what are the implications of the hierarchical choices that you make?" And then the other interesting insight about decision making: the most direct form of democracy doesn't happen by voting on everything. Maybe it happens by reaching a consensus on everything. So there's a bit of frustration with just voting and questions around, do we have a governance structure for consensus making? But that can also take a lot of time. So there's, again, some of the challenges that happen in implementing DAOs in practice. At the end of the thesis, we proposed 4 specific steps that would help ArchiDAO move forward. The first one was to increase the level of blockchain integration. So I would say that this project used a very light touch on blockchain, or not very much blockchain at all. And the idea would be to implement blockchain for more transparent task management and record keeping. So that was particularly something that was pointed out. The second one was to use tools tailored for DAO operations and streamline task assignments and real-time updates. So there, it would be using things like the Politia platform that Jens pointed out, or other ways of task management, which is, again, just good management practice, but also to do it in a way that is also compatible with the DAO form. There was a need to also think about effective reward systems. So the participants went in kind of saying, yeah, we all work together, and it worked well because it was a design competition. But if you would think about this becoming an actual mode of work, how do you develop an effective reward system? Who receives what reward for what contributions on the project? And so there needs to be a lot of thinking around the robustness of a incentive mechanisms for individuals. And then finally, the idea is that there needs to be increase in the implementation of these anonymized voting systems as well. In a way, they kind of, and I think some early DAOs do this a lot, is kind of bypass the kind of on-chain voting because it's a bit more difficult, takes a bit more time. But then at the same time, then what distinguishes you from a DAO and not a just kind of collective if you bypass a lot of these blockchain-based voting protocols? So those are just a few final insights we had from watching ArchiDAO at work, and we continue our thinking and collaboration with them because we're very strong believers in what they're trying to do, and we also think that a lot of the key questions are actually not that technological, but they're more governance and management questions as well that need to be improved moving forward. So with that, I give my thanks from my side. I'm sure the same also applies from Jens's side. You can find a few of our kind of key papers here. There's also a few more which we're happy to share with you if you want to read further.